Hi, folks. Welcome. We're going to kick off in just a few moments, but feel free to settle in, introduce yourself in the chat in the meantime. Hi, folks. Welcome. We're going to get started in just one moment. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat in the meantime. All right, folks, welcome to the third and final webinar of our Vibe Check series, Creating and Sustaining Positive and Inviting School Environments, hosted by the Alliance for Resource Equity. The Alliance for Resource Equity is a partnership between EdTrust and Education Resource Strategies, and our goal is to help make sure that district leaders and advocates are working together to advance resource equity, thinking not only about how much money or resources, but also how well those resources are being used. For this final session, we will be discussing how to use resource equity as a frame to address chronic absenteeism and more specifically kind of unpack some of the themes that we discussed over the past 2 weeks in our previous sessions, authentic family engagement and positive school discipline, as some of the very levers that matter a lot to reducing chronic absenteeism. There's also a lot of other resources that we're not going to have a chance to touch upon today. And so I do think that the overall Alliance for Resource Equity gives us a helpful starting point to help organize some of those other pieces of the puzzle. So let's just take a moment to think about that. We'll be talking about Dimension 6, positive and inviting school climate, but Dimension 9 also outlines learning-ready facilities. So it asks us to consider what is the physical state of the building and how could that be impacting absenteeism? Is there proper AC and ventilation in all classrooms, or students, will they be overheated or freezing cold when they show up to school? And like a really fundamental question, are there safe and reliable kind of like school buses and school bus schedules that get students to school every day on time? Also thinking about the adults in the building, and we'll be hearing about from one important adult in the building, a principal later on in our panel, but do they understand how to support student well-being and express care for their students? And is there kind of a leader at the helm of the ship that understands evidence-based practices to reduce chronic absenteeism and have the capacity to kind of implement those strategies with fidelity? Next, do students understand kind of the value of showing up to school because they find their learning engaging and relevant to their lives? Do they understand, kind of, is learning relevant to their next step, whether that be a meaningful post-secondary opportunity or in their career? And Dimension 7 of the framework, student supports and interventions, ask us to think about students' non-academic needs in a really holistic and integrated way, or students that need additional mental health supports, able to get those to school, like offer a building and a place to meet basic student needs like nutritious meals and things like that. So all of this to say, we really could be doing a webinar session, doing a deep dive into any one of these, dimensions that I outlined today that the Alliance for Resource Equity talks about. Well, mainly, Carl, my colleague, will be sharing a lot about some of the resources that directly talk about the positive and inviting school climate, Dimension 6 of the framework. But they're all interconnected and also kind of also, as we'll talk about, relate to what's happening within our own community and looking at the data, what we can prioritize due to kind of what's the reality in our own district. So I'm going to pass it over to Carl. That's my Alliance for Resource Equity spiel for the day. And I'll just mention one more thing, which is that we will have a Q&A at the end. So as questions come up for you, feel free to use that function over Zoom. And Carl, over to you to introduce yourself, share some resources and the work that EdTrust is doing, and moderate a really fantastic panel.
Awesome. Thank you, Shana, for the wonderful introduction and guiding us into this space. For those who don't know me, my name is Carl Felton III, and I'm a policy analyst here at EdTrust, focusing on SEAD issues such as chronic absenteeism, discipline, family engagement, and a variety of other intersecting areas. Today, we're going to discuss reducing chronic absenteeism. I want to start with first sharing with you all where we'll be going today. First, we'll talk about the state of chronic absenteeism, and then we'll have a panel discussion from a school leader, a technical assistance organization, BARR, and of course, our good friends over at LPI as well will be with us. And then we'll discuss a call to action, which will lead us to learn how all of you can play a role in reducing chronic absenteeism from the seat that you sit in. But let's begin to level set with the definition of chronic absenteeism. I know some folks may wonder, why are we talking about the definition? Well, oftentimes we use so many terms in education, and folks may not have a clear understanding of what is actually happening, although we may be active participants in the process. So chronic absenteeism is defined as missing 10% or more of school for any reason, which includes excused absences, unexcused absences, suspensions. We can also add into this doctor's appointments, extracurricular activities, arts, clubs, and a variety of other things that a student may be absent for. Chronic absenteeism can sometimes be confused with truancy, as not everywhere is there a clear definition of what chronic absenteeism is, and sometimes it can be confused with truancy, which is a focus only on students who have a certain amount of unexcused absences when there's a concern, right? And another difference between chronic absenteeism and truancy is often focused on compliance. When addressing chronic absenteeism is often about how do we support these students and these families in meeting the standards or the expectations in the attendance policies. And lastly, sometimes truancy, or oftentimes truancy, and sometimes chronic absenteeism can be focused on disciplinary actions to get folks to comply, which often result in fines and peace officers and other things. But one thing I think is important for all of us to know about chronic absenteeism is chronic absenteeism is a broad umbrella, and schools have so many policies and practices to address and influence chronic absenteeism. Right? We have discipline policies, we have truancy policies, and there's all these other sick policies which are often talked about. And we'll go deeper into that as this presentation goes on. And so we need to be clear about what chronic absenteeism is and how a student becomes chronically absent, and what gets a student to this category, so that we understand what are some of the things we're looking to address. So let's talk about the state of chronic absenteeism. What is the current landscape with chronic absenteeism? Well, we know that chronic absenteeism is getting a lot of attention today, to the point where this is a national moment for chronic absenteeism. But chronic absenteeism is not a new term by any means. In fact, this has always been an area of concern for many of our schools and districts. When we look at the 2018-2019 pre-pandemic school data, we see that 15% of students nationwide were chronically absent, right? That's about 8 million students at the time. And so chronic absenteeism has been a priority because that's not a data point that folks were accepting, right? And then here we are a few years later. We had the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic came, and there were so many different reasons as to why schools had closed down, but it was really to keep folks safe, right? They wanted to keep folks from getting sick. And there were also just a focus on how do we engage with students in safe ways, right? And so on the heels of that, we see that upon return in the 21-22 school year data collection, that nearly 30% of students nationwide were chronically absent, which equaled about 14.7 million students, right? But what happened, right? Well, what we learned is that all the issues that led to students being chronically absent pre-pandemic were just exacerbated, right? Not only was there the COVID-19 itself, but schools were closed down, and there were different habits formed around sickness and families. Oftentimes students getting sick and families like, hey, listen, we don't want you to spread whatever this may be. We're not sure what you have. But then also schools were the hub of the community. And so when schools closed down, folks were getting support from schools that were no longer in place. So that looked like sickness not getting addressed, different social and emotional supports that students and families had access to with schools being open were no longer available. Then families had job loss, which led to some students, especially our older high school students, they may have been engaged in a job, right? And then there are so many other barriers that students faced that increased the data from the 15% to nearly 30% chronically absent nationwide. And so this is the state of chronic absenteeism that we are in recovery from, right? These are the things that led us here. But let's talk about who has been most impacted by chronic absenteeism. Well, we know that students from low-income backgrounds, students of color, and students with disabilities are in many categories of students who have been impacted the most by chronic absenteeism, right? We know that students from low-income backgrounds have been affected 2 to 3 times more, or 2 to 3 times more likely to be chronically absent. We also know that students of color, as well as those with disabilities, were disproportionately impacted by chronic absenteeism because of the various things that are happening in their families, school communities, right? Uh, Also, this is the thing I really don't want us to miss, is that when we look at chronic absenteeism data, it's often a reflection of the school environment or the school community. And we learned that there are specific student groups that are impacted more than others, such as Native Americans, Pacific Islanders, our Black students, and our students with disabilities, right? And that is why they tend to have higher chronic absenteeism rates. More importantly, and this is also very important, chronic absenteeism data is often a reflection that there's a low sense of belonging in a school environment or for particular students. And so the data is always telling us a story, but it's important that we learn why, right? And another reason why it's very important to address chronic absenteeism and why it needs to be taken seriously is it decreases a student's chances of graduating high school. Um, as we already said, it's an indication of a lack of engagement or a lack of belonging, or that there's something that is preventing from a student wanting to be in school. And there are so many other issues, but that's the who and the why. Now let's get to the how. Like, what are we supposed to do to address chronic absenteeism? Well, what we believe here at Trust is that there are many SEAD practices that can support addressing and reducing chronic absenteeism. The first thing is we need to call out punitive practices. They just do not work. Oftentimes, punitive practices such as parent fining, truancy court, many different things that do nothing but irritate families and break trust, just make the families and the students want to continue to be distant, right? Another thing in that category would be the discipline policies, right? But what we do want to see is we want to see family engagement practices. We also want to see family engagement looking like wraparound services, or we want schools to engage families to learn what are their experiences, what are the barriers, what are the things that are in the way that are keeping them from coming to school. Is it sickness? Has there been a job loss? There are so many different factors, but we need to trust our families to be the experts on their experiences. It's important that we don't tell families what they're experiencing, but we learn from them so that we can all work together to support them. The next thing is the discipline policies, right? Discipline policies need to be restorative because when students are suspended or punished for being chronically absent, then that does not make them want to engage more. It actually makes them want to engage less. Uh, and so that's what really important for us. What you see on the right side of your screen is what are 5 things folks need to know about chronic absenteeism. But I want to highlight that many of the things I've already said are on there. But one of the strategies on there, if you look at strategies 4 and 5, it talks about early intervention and early engagement. And that is critically important. And what that looks like is one of the practices that we used to utilize during my time in Baltimore City Public Schools is to look at the chronic absenteeism data from the previous year and think about over the summer, how can we engage these families and see what supports they need, right? Because what you don't want to do is wait until the 3rd week of school or wait till October and begin to look at the chronic absenteeism data in the moment. But you want to look at who's at risk of being chronically absent in this coming school year. And you want to engage those families and see what's going on and what proactive plans can be put in place to support those students and families. And so that's the how that we promote here at Ed Trust. But I won't belabor our panel any longer. They're going to share even more resources and strategies on the how. At this point, I'd like to call on our panelists to join me on the screen. And let's just take a brief moment, and why don't each of you introduce yourselves in the order that you are on the screen, and just share your name, your organization, and where you're located.
Hi there, I'll kick this off. My name is Laura Hernandez. I'm a senior researcher at the Learning Policy Institute, currently located in Oakland, California. And at LPI, I design and lead qualitative research on whole child educational approaches and the systems and structures that enable them. Very honored to be here.
Thank you so much to the Ed Trust for inviting me. My name is Angela Jerabek. I'm the developer of the BARR model, Building Assets, Reducing Risks, and the executive director of the BARR Center. I was a high school counselor out of a first-ring suburb outside of Minneapolis when I developed the model, and now we have the privilege of working with over 375 schools in 24 states, including partnering with incredible schools like Principal Omang's.
Awesome.
Good afternoon. My name is Josh Omang. I'm a principal here in the northwestern part of Minnesota. Our district serves a large Native American population, and we've been using the BARR model for 4 years, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, but certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here and share what we're doing today.
Awesome. Glad to have each of you, and can't wait to continue to learn more about what you're doing and what you've done to reduce chronic absenteeism from your seat. Let's start with Angela. Angela, could you briefly share with us, you already gave us a slight introduction into BARR, but for those who don't know what BARR is, could you tell us about BARR, what BARR stands for, and just give us a brief overview?
I sure will. Thank you again. So BARR, once again, we're a K-12 coaching and training partner. We work with schools. We believe so strongly that the schools have the staff that can do this work, and they have incredibly talented kids, but we've got to work on the system so we can really be focused on the whole child. So We work with schools really to improve the overall system, and we improve academics as well as reduce discipline and decrease chronic absenteeism. So we are really focused on using real-time data, quantitative and qualitative data to increase student engagement and overall well-being. So that's kind of the big overview of BARR. I'm happy to explain more if you want me to keep going, or should I pause?
I think that's great. That takes us into our next question. What would you say are some of the guiding principles that you all use at BARR in your approach to reducing chronic absenteeism?
Perfect. So one of the key pieces is we just need to be able to recognize who that whole student is to make sure that they are feeling seen, they're feeling safe, and they're feeling supported. We need that for both the students and for the families. I think the other key piece is the adults in the building, especially the teachers, they need to know what those barriers are. Why are those students not coming to school? What are the barriers? Is it chronic illness? Is it transportation? Is it I'm feeling bullied? But if we can empower those classroom teachers to see what those barriers are and empower them to remove them, I think that's when you get the big movement in terms of kind of the outcomes. Kind of real briefly, just so the origination is, I was a high school counselor, first ring suburb outside of Minneapolis. We went 5 years in a row that half the ninth graders failed a course. Those same students also were not attending regularly. And I so appreciate your definition of chronic absenteeism versus truancy, because there was a whole lot of gifted and talented students that were not attending regularly because of all of the outside activities that they were participating in, that they were still not in school in terms of that. But how to be able to know who that student is such a critical piece. So after 5 years of kids failing, I went to the principal to say, I think I should resign. Clearly, kids coming to school is a very basic part of my job. And he said, this wasn't just our school, this was a national issue, and really said, come up with another model. So it was kind of during that time that I realized my role as a counselor, and I saw there's a lot of counselors on this, I often got to know a lot more about that student than my classroom teachers did. That this was not about my classroom teachers not caring about the kids. They just didn't know it. They had 43 minutes to get to know who Josh was. And they're like, he's not very good at math. And that's all they would know. They wouldn't know that he was really good at English or really involved in, the plays or really involved in a synagogue. None of that information was access that they had, let alone knowing why he wasn't coming, to first hour because he had a busing issue. So I kept going, this is not a reflection of my colleagues and them not caring. It's a reflection of the system. So how we could change the system was really kind of a key piece, to which I thought we should redesign the school. 2 pillars. One's got to be around relationships. How can we build those relationships, staff to student to student, and then staff to staff? Because that factory siloed system is really hard on adults. At the same time is how could we get real-time data? Did not want data from 7 months ago. What is the real-time data of when they're coming to school, as well as how they're doing in school, as well as qualitative data? What's happening at recess? What's happening on the athletic fields? What is happening in these other places? And how can I bring that forward? And how also can we focus on what's working? What is the strength of the student? What is the strength of that family? And how do we leverage all of our conversations to start being anchored in strengths versus deficits? So that's really how BARR originated. And then I'll just kind of do another kind of quick summary and keep going. But one of the pieces in terms of the work I had done is, as an educator, I had been asked to do a number of things that were questionable at best in terms of its effectiveness, which I kept thinking, who has vetted this? I cannot believe this has ever worked at other places. So I committed myself to say, if I was going to have another educator to do this, I absolutely needed to have research go with it. It had to be evidence-based, because there's no way I'm going to ask other people to take this practices on. So subsequently, we, after 10 years at our school, I then applied for an I3 grant, Investing in Innovation. We are the only model to get all 3 levels of that I3 grant. And we actually did the most rigorous research you can do. We did randomized control trials. So I could get rid of the argument of, well, this happened at my school because I had a bad principal, or this good thing happened is because we won the basketball championship. So I'm like, let's do really rigorous research. So we had 78 schools participate in randomized control trials in 24 states, kind of across the country, to be able to say, in a rural setting, urban setting, charter schools, public schools, is this making a difference? Is the system making a difference? And the American Institutes of Research, AIR, concluded, yes, when you actually have a system that's focused on these two things, you get 20 statistically significant impacts, both for students and the adults. What I really want to point out here is that this is also healthier for the adults. One of our early outcomes we hear from a number of our schools is the teachers are coming more regularly. They're not calling for subs. If you are in a place that people are seeing and hearing you, both as an adult and a student, it's a healthier place to come. So as you see, one of our outcomes is reducing chronic absenteeism. And we're in the What Works Clearinghouse, evidence for ESSA, as well as we reduce risk behaviors. So I talk about building assets and reducing risks. So you'll be able to hear kind of more illustrations of this from Josh Omang, in his school, but like broadly, we've done this in a variety of settings. And then I'll have just one more kind of concluding slide on our work, and then I'll kind of, turn it over. But when we're able to talk about this, what I want to say is what we really found, which is not shocking, is if you're looking for students to be, behaving in a different way, it always starts with the adults. How are the adults feeling? How are they connecting? And how is that work going forward? So.
I appreciate you sharing all of that, Angela. You said so many great things about students being seen, safe, and supported. I appreciated your focus around the data and the relationships, because at the end of the day, everyone's a human being. And those are the things that we need. What we need is relationship to move forward, right? Trust is a major factor in a school building, right? Whether you're the principal, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a student, folks need to know that they can trust you to depend on you to play whatever role that you play, whether it's an adult or a student. So I appreciate you sharing that. But I also appreciate you talking about what are the strengths of the families, even if they're struggling, because everyone has those. And with that said, I'm gonna transition to you, Principal Omang. What would you say are some of the strategies you've used to address chronic absenteeism, and what are the impacts you've seen in your school environment as a result? We'll come back. We'll come back. How about we do this? Angela, what are some of the things that you've seen?
Yes. I'll go broadly, and I'm sure Principal Omang will be back. I guess one of the pieces I want to put more broadly than BARR, and it goes back to the mediation analysis, is how can we really work with the adults to have them be connected, have them be able to have access to real-time data. And once again, if we're going to ask them to see barriers, how do we empower them to help remove those barriers or get to the right people to remove those barriers? Because I think that that's an important, really broad message that oftentimes we're trying to like fix the kids versus how can we empower the adults in the building to both, see what's happening, see the challenges that are occurring, and then once again, allow them to say, and here are solutions that we can really move that forward.
That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Let's bring Laura into the conversation. There are so many different strategies and great things that even Angela has shared already. But what would you say that you've learned about strategies from a research perspective to reduce chronic absenteeism?
Thank you for inviting me in. Happy to jump in at this time. I think a key piece of the puzzle or key theme that keeps coming up for me in our research and conversations that we're having is that so much of the work about reducing chronic absenteeism is proactive and preventative in nature, right? I've heard the words trust a lot already, which you are going to hear a lot in when I talk about family engagement, relationships. So much of this work is, on the front end and ongoing and long term in terms of trying to build those connections. And it of course extends to students, how they are known and valued and seen and validated in their school environments. as well as the educators. I really appreciate you mentioning that, Angela, about kind of the health and wellness of the educators and staff in the building and how much that means and fuels all of this. But also that sort of being known, cared for extends to families as well. So all of these actors kind of coming together and really trying to see each other as humans with care, dignity, and just appreciation. And so some of those things are very informal, right? They're greeting the person at the gate when they're dropping their students off, or at your front door if you're an educator. There are, all of these different programs that folks have in terms of communication. So it's sending that text message saying, hey, your student did really great in class today, or those sorts of things go a very long way in terms of laying kind of a foundation of trust. So when interventions or challenges do emerge, there's a more willingness and openness to engage.
That's great. Thank you. And let's go a little bit deeper into that. What would you say you've learned about the relationship between chronic absenteeism and family engagement specifically, since, we're heading down that path?
Sure. Happy to keep going there. So we know a lot from both recent and longstanding research about the positive relationship between family engagement and student outcomes in regard to even things like achievement data, behavior patterns, social emotional development, and of course, attendance is no different. So when we do have powerful family engagement practices in place, we do see young people are more likely to attend school on a consistent basis. And there was a recent study by the New Teacher Project and Learning Heroes that actually found that schools with stronger family engagement before the pandemic experienced better than expected attendance, achievement, and school climate measures after the pandemic. So it really kind of fueled, it was able to kind of bridge some of the challenges that some of the schools are seeing. But I mention that because I think we do have a lot of evidence that are telling us about the positive correlations around family engagement and outcomes. So there's many researchers, including us at LPI, that are really trying to understand the what and the how behind those numbers, right? What are the strategies and practices that are being put in place? And what's the quality and tenor of those exchanges, right? How are they fostering that trust, which we know is an essential ingredient into all of this? And so a recent LPI report, thank you for who shared it in the chat, it's called Reducing Chronic Absenteeism, Lessons from Community Schools, really tried to unpack and explore those questions. And for context, that report is really drawing on data from a broader study of how local educational agencies in California are using the $4.1 billion investment in community schools. So for those unfamiliar with community schools, it's a whole child, whole school improvement strategy that's really trying to organize in school and out of school supports to enable success and well-being, usually with the addition of dedicated personnel like a coordinator, social worker, counselors, things like that. But through this broader study of trying to understand how people were leveraging their monies and building community schools, there were these community schools that really stood out in terms of the significant reduction to chronic absenteeism they were making. So we really dug in. We wanted to understand what those particular schools were doing. And so this report kind of profiles 4 different schools that span the state, range in size and geography. And what we found that even if they were vastly different contexts, they were engaging in similar approaches that were preventative, proactive, and also interventionist when need be to address chronic absenteeism. And so I can speak more to the range of findings, but I'll hone in on the family engagement piece because that absolutely emerged as a key pillar in their efforts. And one of the things was what I was just speaking to earlier, which is that this long-term ongoing work of relationship building with families over time. So it's the small interactions, but it also included things like culture building activities on campus. So community events beyond the back to school night, right? Like welcoming the community onto campus for fun activities, things like that. But also one of the fun anecdotes I'll raise was that building that culture of family engagement among staff. So one of the schools in our study also did a family engagement bingo. So they were trying to engage all of their staff in this cards where it had activities that were trying to promote positive interactions with families, one of which was like mailing 3 postcards home praising a parent, things of that nature. And so they were really trying to kind of get it in the water and make it a fun, incentivized activity among staff. So just wanted to raise that up as an example. But it's all of those activities coming together that kind of lay that foundation that allow for more targeted conversations and communication when issues emerge. Things like, text messages home, phone calls home if a student is absent, Also kind of more intensive outreach around one-on-one conversations and home visits were also things that were promoted. But the one thing I'll offer there, and then I'll stop because I've taken up a lot of time here, is those conversations and that outreach always started from a position of support. So Carl, you mentioned kind of that restorative orientation. They were non-punitive in terms of their orientation or accusatory. They always started with questions like, what can we do? How can we support you? And there was usually offers of all the different services and interventions that were in place in a given setting around how to do that. And another piece that underscores your point, Carl, at the top of our webinar today was really about how these approaches really help to ease and mitigate some of those negative feelings or fears of stigma, repercussions that can often prevent parents and guardians from engaging in school settings after truancies or absences or things of that nature. So it really went a long way how this kind of supportive orientation with this ongoing relationship building kind of coalesced to be able to really make things effective.
Thank you. And so the thing that I'm hearing from everything you shared, Laura, is relationship building, being intentional about supporting families and making sure families know, right, to break down those barriers that may impede trust. It just sounds like intentionality is the key. Being intentional about making sure families know that the school is not trying to burden you, but the school is here to support you and help you to meet the standards, the expectations, and to comply with the policies, of course, but really making it about the families and the student more so than the policies. And with that said, we'll come back to you, Principal Omang. What would you say are some of the strategies you all have used at Detroit Lakes High School, and what are some of the impacts if you've seen as a result to reduce chronic absenteeism?
Absolutely. I appreciate you working with me there. We had a strange power surge, the whole building. So
no problem. You're here now.
So anyway, yeah, those are all the things that we're talking about are certainly things that we've experienced through the use of the BARR model. And as Angela has said earlier, the relationship piece is huge. And that has really transformed our building and got some of these results that I'm going to show you. This slide just kind of shows just a reminder of who we have here at our school. We're at about 20% or so American Indian, and our population of economically disadvantaged, as you mentioned, those are two groups that we saw a huge dip in attendance with after COVID, after the pandemic. So on the next slide, I like to show what's happened, and we were actually at about 45% at the end of that pandemic year. Which was a lot. I mean, and there's like Carl was saying, there's just so many factors, and sometimes as a school you have so many things that you're trying to do and so many one-off programs. I think the biggest impact for us here at BARR doing the BARR model is it takes all those programs and puts it into one, and it empowers your entire staff to be involved. So that's one thing that I always say that's very different about doing BARR, is that it's not just me and our assistant principal or a few motivated people in the building. It's everybody, and it's every day. And that model really helps. It helps to build trust with your staff, with your students, that you're actually there to help them, and we come at things from that approach that was just being talked about, which is support first, and then we can figure out anything. So you can see we've reduced here. This is our 4th year of doing BARR. The end of the month here, the first month of school, we're down to 13.9% chronically absent, and that is the lowest we have had since I have data back to 2007. So that is the lowest that we have ever had since then, for sure, here. And then I do break it down by student, and we keep track of how many students, which the next slides show, just overall, how many students did we have, that were chronically absent during those time periods. And then this helps us because it is one of those real-time data pieces that we can look into. And one thing we often do is when we see kids going off track, I probably should have showed that slide on here, but I have a slide that I use with a salmon going over the falls. And I use that with my staff because we always talk about, we want to go farther up the river and stop things before they, before the salmon's going over the falls. That's kind of the old model of school, where we looked at the data at the end of the year and we're, either happy or not. So we're trying to catch things way earlier. This helps us because we identify those kids that are within like 88 to 89%. So they just went off track, and then we intervene right there and we talk to them, bring them in, have a very positive conversation and say, hey, if you go to school one more day, or what's happened on these days, because that's where you can make a huge impact. So that's been good. We also have a system of communication that we develop for those kids too, that our teachers use, and that has helped us. And it's just a simple link that sends an email to the kid, to the parent, to the teacher, and it has the whole email is based on what Laura was talking about, is just the that supportive approach. Hey, here's what we've noticed. How can we help? And then I do have the ethnic, same chart on the next slide that just shows the ethnicity data for our American Indian students. We spend a lot of time, this is a group, as you mentioned, Carl, that, research would show that they have a lot more barriers, and especially here in our district, some of the kids live 40 miles away from the high school. And so you put that on top of it, and, there's a lot of barriers. So this model has shown an awesome results with those kids, and it certainly has connected them to our school and worked really well. And then lastly, I just want to show, because this is one piece of the BARR model that has really made a huge impact, and that is how we have engaged our county. And so on that last slide, there is a chart that kind of shows how we redesigned our system of dealing with the kids when they do have chronic absenteeism. And so what we did was we went to our county and enlisted all those folks to be on our team, which is called a Community Connect. It's like for our kids that are most struggling kids, whether it's attendance, behavior, whatever. We have those folks come directly to our meetings, and our meetings happen every other week. And we have 19 people on our committee, and there's only 9 of those people that are school people. The rest of them are from the county, or social workers, or mental health, or chemical health. And we developed this way of dealing with it that has really resulted in those data metrics that I showed you, I believe. So it starts with our teachers, and it shows what we ask them to do. They utilize our BARR model at those different levels. It then goes to our admin. And then instead of just doing the truancy process like we used to, or the letters and all that, we've enlisted the social workers. And so if a kid gets a 3-day letter, the letter is kind of the secondary part. The main part for us is that is the point where we have a meeting with the kid, with the social worker and the family right here at our building. And and that's where we do that supportive problem solving meeting. So it has nothing punitive at all. It's totally focused on, hey, here's what we're noticing. What can we do to help? Here's some resources we can connect you to. And that is by far the one thing that's really made our results stick, I believe, is just a commitment to that and engaging those people. So I appreciate you being flexible with me again. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened, but I'm sure I'll find out here when we're done.
No problem. It's all good. Listen, we've got a couple more moments left, but there's a question I would love to start with you, Principal Omang. And so there's a sentiment among some that addressing chronic absenteeism is too difficult, it's too challenging, it's too resource intensive. But can you help dispel some of the myths around and share how this challenge is something that all schools can work to address?
Absolutely. I think one thing I often say is, sometimes we are always in the mindset of we're like waiting for somebody to come help, or who's going to come save us from this. And I always like say to our staff, we are the people. We are the people that are here to help, and there's no one else coming. So one of the reasons I'm such a huge believer in this BARR model is one of their taglines, right? Same students, same teachers, better results. That's true because it does empower people on a team mentality, and I think if you've been around schools, you all know that it's very easy to say, well, attendance or truancy, well, that's Josh's thing. I'm going to do math or I'm going to do, and the reality is we need to think differently. And this model helps you do that. It takes our focus on the 900 things and puts them where they should be. Right. And that's on the kids and how we can help the kids. So, I mean, it helps you stay positive. Seems like there's some doom and gloom these days in education, but definitely I would say that that's why we're here. We're here to make people better. And this is a model that can have results anywhere.
Principal Omang, I'm going to bump in here only because your engagement, well, with you having such a connection with the White Earth Reservation, but your reflection in the school has also been a notable shift. So Dr. Hernandez, when you were talking about how the school should be reflecting the community, I think of the number of ceremonies and different things that are happening at the school that I feel leans into that family feels welcome there. If you wouldn't mind at least providing a little bit, because that seems to be recent and also under your leadership, if you don't mind.
Yep. So one thing that we do is we have what's called an eagle feather ceremony for our Native American students who are in 12th grade and they're going to graduate. And it is a traditional ceremony where we have an elder from our reservation that comes in, and each student, we host it here at the school. I think this year we have 40 some seniors, so it's our biggest group that we've had. And what happens is each one of those kids gets an eagle feather, and they talk about what the symbol of it is, and they can wear that as part of their graduation regalia. We also do all kinds of other cultural things like smudging. We had some kids go do some wild ricing here just a couple weeks ago because this is the season to do it. So they went out, and they have a funny story about their canoe blowing away that day because it was super windy. But we want to be reflective of who we are, all of our groups. And so we've done a lot of things to try to improve that.
It sounds like there's been a space that's been created to uplift the experiences of the students and families in your school. And it sounds like that has helped with the engagement. And there's a theme that all three of you have shared around support, right? I appreciate you, Principal Omang, sharing about gone are the days of focusing on that's Carl's thing, that's Josh's thing, that's attendance, right? Because as we know, going back to Angela's point, when educators feel unsupported, they get burnt out and they're disengaged. And those are the things that lead adults in the building to becoming disengaged and hands off, right? And so the health of the adults, them feeling supported, then in turn leads to them supporting each other, which helps them all to support the students. Right. So that's a common thing I'm hearing today as we talk about chronic absenteeism. Why don't we take a moment? We've got about 5 minutes before we land the plane. Why don't I have one of my colleagues come on and share some of our audience questions?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Duchesneau. I'm just gonna share some of the questions. So one of the questions that showed up is around punitive approaches. So how do punitive approaches to address chronic absenteeism risk deepening feelings of mistrust between educators and families? And how can we effectively push back against these efforts to punish families?
Why don't we start with Principal Omang? He shared a little bit about one of when we had our prep call, he shared about some of the policy changes, and then we'll go to Laura.
Yeah, I think one thing that you have to work through with that is there's a belief, whether it's attendance or you know, whatever, that you can punish your way to better data. And I think that is that's an old school mentality that, honestly, what I say is that will never work again, right? I mean, I don't know that it actually worked when I was a kid. I know that we were probably scared of that, but the reality is it didn't work like we think it did. And so that's where for us, the using the real-time data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, like we do surveys and stuff with our kids, ask them, you know, you got to get to the root cause of why they're not coming. And if they're not coming because they feel like they're bullied, but then suddenly you suspend them because they're not coming or whatever. I mean, that's an extreme example, but it does cause, I mean, there is huge power in the supportive approach, because as soon as you say that to the parents, now they're on your team, right? Because they're struggling too. Most of the time, what I just met with a family yesterday, actually, and the parents are frustrated and struggling too. And so if you can, you know, bridge that relationship with a supportive approach, you're going to get all kinds of way better results than, you know, here you go, you're in trouble, I'm the principal, I'm mad at you because you don't come to school, you know. So I'm yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answered the question, but
You did. Thank you. Yes. And what I'm hearing is engaging the parents as partners. Uh, why don't we go to Laura?
Sure, just a few additional thoughts. I was thinking of Principal Omang's final slide about that, you know, the 3-day notice. I saw something on the graphic that said there was like a legal requirement to send home something. So there's some elements of this that are legal, right? That schools can't avoid and have to do. But to me, if you will, subversive nature of that, how do you push against it, is exactly what Principal Omang was raising, which was that we're bringing them in, we're having a conversation of support. So this doesn't land and it's open to interpretation in a way that would invoke some negative feelings or aversion, if you will, or disengagement. So it's really about how you bring them in while still obviously having to meet your requirements here. And that's just on the parent front. I see the same exact parallel to what Principal Meg was saying in terms of how we're engaging students in the process as well too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Laura. Do we have time for one more question, or should we transition to land the plane? Go ahead, Nancy.
I think we have time for just one quick one more, if all panelists can agree to be swift with their responses. In what ways would you like to see federal policymakers support districts in addressing chronic absenteeism?
I'd be happy to jump in this. I think one of the challenges that schools are having in terms of doing this work of how do you change the system is the funding doesn't show up to change the system. So the funding shows up just like Principal, Omang said, where it's like, this is chronic absenteeism money. So this is the team that gets this money to do this. And this is the person that's going to work on academics. So having the federal funding support the idea of we could actually improve the system, and if we work together, we can do this. And if you can empower the teachers to say, what's the issue? And I can get a solution, and then they feel appropriately effective in their jobs, is really helpful. But the silos that we have at the schools feels like it just gets bigger and larger and more powerful as you go upstream. So having federal policies and federal funding reflect this. We do have talented educators there, and we have very talented kids. And let's get us in a system to be able to do this work.
That's awesome. Appreciate that response. Why don't we begin to transition with Nancy to talk about how we can all get involved?
Great. So the Education Trust created an alliance with AEI and Attendance Works with an initiative for states to get involved with a 50% by 5-year goal. So that's reducing chronic absenteeism by 50% within 5 years. We believe that this is certainly a challenge, but certainly also one that states can meet if they choose to put their priorities into addressing chronic absenteeism. You can find out more about that in the link that my colleague just posted in the chat, or the QR code that's up at the top over there. At the district level and the school level, our Alliance for Resource Equity toolkit is really great at identifying how to equitably allocate resources to address a number of issues within schools. But since we know through this conversation that a big part of addressing chronic absenteeism is creating a welcoming and inclusive environment, we have a number of resources within there to really address that. And so that would be particularly helpful for school and district advocates and policymakers. And then finally, I just want to lift the great work that Attendance Works does. They have a number of actions that they recommend that policy leaders can take, that educators can take, and they provide great resources on specifically addressing chronic absenteeism, including for advocates, some really great messaging ideas to really push policymakers to prioritize chronic absenteeism. And finally, we've come to the end of our third webinar in this series. We'd love for you to give us feedback about today's session. There's a QR code there on the left for you to fill out. And then finally, we'd love for you to also stay in the loop with our newsletter. And you'll see the QR code for that on the right-hand side. Thank you all so much for joining our webinar. Thank you so much to the panelists, to Carl, to Shayna. And if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll also be providing contact information and resources in a follow-up email. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you everyone so much, and we'll see you again soon.